Hi everyone, my name is Adam Lazar and I'm the Senior Graphic Designer at CJ's SeniorLife. Thanks so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to show you how to turn a pile of fabric into a drawstring bag. I really like this project because it's really versatile. You could use it to store your own supplies in, or you could use it instead of a gift bag, or you could even store snacks in it. What do I have in mind? Chips. So join me over on the sewing machine and I'll show you how to make this. Before we begin, let's take a closer look at the bag. For this project, I've used two fabrics, a solid as well as a pattern, and I've also used shoelaces as the drawstring to close and open the bag. In order for the drawstring to work, we're going to need to sew a pocket that runs around the entire bag. We'll also need to have an opening on both sides so the drawstring can be pulled out. They're going to go from opposite directions, so that when we pull on the drawstring, it closes up the bag and creates this nice top. For the drawstring, I'm using a pair of shoelaces. I found this great package of miscellaneous colored shoelaces, and I think the bright colors offer a nice contrast to the black and white fabric that we're using. Like any printed fabric, this black and white fabric has a right side and a wrong side. And the right side is the part that's printed and the wrong side is not. So we might be sewing something right sides together, and that's where we put the pattern pieces facing each other. I've also created an instruction sheet on how to create this drawstring bag. You can find this at www.cje.net/cyberclub. This gives you step-by-step instructions over what I'm going to go through the video today. I've already cut down my palms fabric to 39 inches by 11 inches. This is quite a long piece because this functions as the interior of the bag as well as half of the exterior. The other piece that I have is the shoelaces. So we need a pair, and they need to be about 32 inches long. And the final piece I need to cut down is the solid fabric. And this needs to be cut down to 11 inches by 11 inches square. And I've already cut down one measurement to 11, and I need to cut the other side as well. My preferred method is to use a grid mat like I'm using here, as well as a quilting ruler, because they have grids on both the mat as well as the ruler. So what I do is I line the fabric up with the grid lines on the mat, and I line the ruler up with the opposite direction lines on the mat. And that allows me to create a nice square cut. So I hold the ruler down nice and firm with one hand, and I use a sharp rotary blade to cut down the measurement. Now if you don't have a mat and a ruler like I do, you can use a regular tape measure. You would just put one end of the tape measure against the raw edge of the fabric and mark your measurement in a few different places. And then you combine that with another straight edge, and this can be any ruler, and just draw a line connecting those dots. And once you've completed that, you'll have a nice crisp line to follow. And if you have a nice sharp pair of scissors that you only use for fabric, you'll be able to get a nice crisp cut. Now that we have both pieces of fabric cut down to size, we're going to sew the two together. First, we're going to start with the short edge, and we're going to line up our two pieces of fabric along that edge and pin them together. I like the pins to be put into the fabric so that the pin head is hanging off the edge of the fabric and the pin is perpendicular to the edge of the fabric that I'm sewing. So now we're going to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance down that edge. Alright, so you'll notice that I have a couple of pieces of tape on my machine. That's going to be for later on in the project, and we'll come back to that later. But for right now, I'm going to use the 1/2 inch mark that's on the metal plate of my sewing machine to tell me where to sew the fabric. What I'm doing is I'm butting up the raw edge of the fabric with that 1/2 inch mark. So I'll place the fabric in the machine, I'm going to lower the presser foot. I'm going to take just a few stitches forward, and once I've done that, I'm going to use the back stitch button to lock in the stitches, and then I'll continue sewing forward all the way down. As I go, I'm removing each one of the needles so I don't sew over them. So I've made it all the way to the end, and just before I get to the end, I'm going to again use the back stitch button, and that's going to secure the seam. I'll take a few stitches forward, lift the presser foot, and then I'll use my scissors to trim the threads from the machine. Okay, I've sewn one edge with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and now we need to do the same with the other two edges. So I'm going to line up the blue and the palms fabric, and I'm going to pin those and head back over to the sewing machine and do the same thing of sewing a 1/2 inch seam allowance down this edge as well. Alright, both of our edges are sewn together, and next step is to press our seams open. So we do this by flattening out the fabric and opening up the seams and using an iron to press them flat. We do this so that the bulk of the fabric is shared on both sides of the seam and it isn't all on one edge. Now that we've done that, we're going to fold the fabric in half so that the palms fabric is folded flat on top of itself and the blue fabric is also folded flat on top of itself. What we want to do is line up these two seams, and we want to get them really lined up perfectly. I don't like to use the word perfect in sewing a lot of times, but there are a few places where it's important to get things really nice and neat, because if they're off by a little bit, that's where your eye is going to go to see it. So I'm going to do this by pushing a pin right into the seam from one side to the other, and that pin is going to help line up that edge perfectly. And I'll show you where this comes into play on the bag. You'll see on our finished sample that it's really nice that this line goes all the way across. It's nice and even, and it isn't offset or anything off kilter. Now that we have that lined up, we're going to give a nice press to those folded edges. And now we can move on to making some marks on the project so that we can start closing up the sides. What I want to do is measure from the printed fabric, the pressed edge, 13 inches and make a mark, and then also at 14 inches and make a mark in both of those spots. Also want to do this on the other side. So again, we'll start with 13 inches from the edge of the printed fabric and move on to 14 inches and place a mark there as well. We also need to leave an opening so that we can turn our piece right side out. So we're going to leave a 3-inch opening, and we'll do that just on one of the sides, and we'll mark it in the same way. The reason that we're making these markings is that we need to sew the pocket for the drawstring to go through, and we want it to be lined up. So we've made our red mark, but I also find that it's helpful to put 2 pins right next to each other in a spot where we don't want to sew. So when we are sewing this long edge closed, we're going to skip this spot, the spot between the 13-inch and the 14-inch. We do not want to sew there. And the 2 pins are going to remind us as we're sewing on the machine that we need to stop. Okay, I'm ready to close up the sides, but I'm going to start here where the 3-inch opening is. I've put double pins there as well, and those double pins are going to remind me to leave this area open. So I'm going to slide the fabric in so the needle lines up with the red mark that I made, and I'm going to remove those double pins because they were only there to remind me not to sew that space. So again, I'll lower my presser foot, I'll take a few stitches forward, and then I'll backstitch using the backstitch button, and then continue to sew all the way down. So as I'm sewing, I notice the double pins, and that reminds me again to stop sewing. This is the long pocket that's going to be used for the drawstrings. So what I want to do is sew up to the red line, and I definitely want to backstitch here because this is going to get some use. and then sew a few more stitches forward, and then I'm going to remove my project from the machine and trim the thread, and then we're just going to continue on our way, skipping that 1 inch. So again, this is the 13-inch and 14-inch mark. So that's, again, the double pins are going to show me where to start. So it's just like starting fresh on another edge. We're going to lower the presser foot, stitch a few forward, stitch a few back, and then I'll just continue sewing all the way down. Now I do want to point out that where we pressed our seams open, that can get kind of bulky and twisted under the presser foot. So you want to be careful when you get here. You want to make sure that you're keeping both of those areas flat. And as you sew over it, you can go slowly, removing the pins as you go all the way to the end, and of course, do a couple of back stitches. And now that this edge is finished, we're going to flip our project around and do the same thing sewing on the other edge. Now that both are finished, I'm going to turn the project right side out. I found that 3-inch mark, the opening, and I'm reaching in carefully to pull one of the corners from the opposite edge through so that it's right side out. Now I'm using a chopstick here, and that's to help me poke out the corners. Just have that 3-inch opening, and it's a little hard to get my hand in there, and the chopstick is going to help me get this so that all the corners are nice and crisp. Want to make sure that the project is flat, nothing is tucked in, and now we'll use our iron to give it a good press. Using your iron throughout the sewing process is really helpful to get things nice and neat. So this is the 3-inch opening, and I just want to fold in those raw edges and press them down so that they line up with the space that is sewn. Now we're ready to tuck the exterior into the interior of the bag. So I do that just by starting at the end of the palms fabric and pushing it in. And again, I'll use the chopstick so that those two corners are lined up with each other and are nice and crisp. Okay, so now that I've done that, we're going to flatten out the bag and get our iron and give it another press, again, just to make sure that everything is nice and clean. And our next step is to sew the pocket that the drawstring goes through. You'll notice that on the sides, there are the two openings that we're going to use for the drawstring, and that'll line up just where that 14-inch mark was. To do this, we're going to remove the bed of the sewing machine, and this will reveal the free arm portion of the machine. This allows us to wrap fabric all the way around the machine. If you remember those two pieces of tape that I put on my machine, I measured so that they would be 1 inch and 2 inch away from my sewing machine needle. So what I'm doing is I'm butting the edge of the fabric up against the blue tape because that's 1 inch away. I'm going to lower my presser foot, do a back stitch, and I'm going to sew all the way around from beginning to end, the whole time making sure that my edge of the fabric is up against the blue painter's tape, because that again is my 1 inch mark. So go all the way around, do a reverse stitch, remove the project from the machine by snipping off the thread, and then I'm going to slide it over from the blue to the white tape. And this is again 2 inches. So I'll end up with a 1 inch pocket. I'm going to do the same process where I have the fabric lined up with the edge of the white tape, and I'm going all the way around the project from beginning to end, making one continuous loop. Now that we've completed sewing the pocket, we can thread the shoelaces through. So I do this by using a safety pin, and I fold over the shoelace and safety pin it bent over on itself. This is going to help me thread the shoelace through the pocket. I find one of the openings that we left, and I'm going to thread the safety pin through, gather up a little bit of fabric on the safety pin, and pull it through. Now when we get to the opening on the opposite end, we're just going to bypass it. We're going to keep going because whatever opening we went in, that's the opening we want to come out with the shoelace. So now that we have the shoelace coming out the same opening that we started with, we'll flatten out the fabric and we're going to remove the safety pin and we'll tie the shoelace ends together. So we want to do this pretty close to the end, and we're just going to use a simple slip knot, making sure that the two shoelaces are lined up when we do this. So a simple slip knot, and we'll try to get it as close to the end as possible. Now that the first shoelace is done, we're going to do the same process with the second shoelace. Of course, we're going to go in from the opposite opening of the first shoelace. Same thing again, we'll use the safety pin and we'll go in from the opposite opening, make our way all the way around, and you'll see that when we get to the opening that we started with, we'll pull out the second shoelace and do the same process. Remove the safety pin and make a simple slip knot to tie the two ends of that second shoelace together. Now that both of the shoelaces are tied, we just need to adjust things a little bit, make sure that they're flat and they're hanging out the two openings evenly. As long as you had the two shoelace ends matched up when you tied them, then this won't be a problem. You'll just be able to move it around a bit. Now, for the last step is we need to close the opening that we left when we were going to turn the project right side out. We could have done this before, but I like to do this at the very end because just in case we need to get back into the bag and adjust something, we have that opening available. So again, we'll press this down, and we left a 3-inch opening, and what we want to do is close it up, but we'll use a seam that's a little bit longer, maybe about 4.5 inches, so we overlap the part that's already sewn. The measurement that we want to use for closing up this opening is going to be about 1/4 inch. We want to line up the edge of the fabric with the edge of our presser foot. I know that on my machine that gives me about 1/4 inch. And what we want to do is use a smaller seam than the 1/2 inch because we know we've got a 1/2 inch of folded fabric on the inside and we want the seam to be a little bit narrower so that we catch the raw edges. And that is the end of the sewing for this project. So the only thing left to do now is to tuck the interior back in. We've got this cute little bag, we've got a drawstring that helps close it up nice and easy, and on the inside we've got our print, and that's it. I hope you've enjoyed sewing this project with me. Be sure to head over to our website for the sewing instructions and a lot more videos. That's www.cje.net/cyberclub. Thanks for joining me today.